I'm Jim Check. You're watching Now Media. With me, Paul Finch, the president of the BC General Employees Union. Welcome. Thank you for joining me this morning.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Why don't we get right down to it? Maybe first of all, who does the BCGEU actually represent? Like, it's a broad scope of people, right? Some people think it's the Government Employees Union, but it's a lot more than that, right?
We're the General Employees Union, so that includes 34,000 direct government civil servants, the ones who are currently on job action, a portion of those on job action, but we represent over 97,000 workers across the province. We're the largest and most diverse union in the province, and so we represent people in both the private sector, the broader public sector, as well as direct government.
You were just in Kelowna here on the picket lines with people. Who in Kelowna specifically are you representing?
Yeah, so there's too many groups to mention that representing Kelowna. It's the same kind of diversity you see across the province. So everything from community living to community social services, highways maintenance, it just goes on. But it's our direct government civil service workers, of course, that are on the picket lines. There's that one office on Bernard Avenue that we've erected a picket line as of yesterday at 7 a.m.
And then also BC wildfire fighters as well. You've highlighted them a few times in some of your discussions. You're saying some of them are only getting $28 an hour.
Well, the typical wildfire makes about $28 an hour. That's the typical wage. There's obviously some exceptions, but yes, we represent the entirety of the BC Wildfire Service, and so the approximately 1,800 members of that service are all BCG members.
And then you're saying that there's a lot of misinformation being put out by the NDP government. What is that misinformation? What are you guys asking for, and what are they saying you're asking for?
Yeah, so let me contextualize this if I've got the latitude to do that. We're in talks, and obviously, basically we started negotiations in January. They weren't very fruitful, and we broke off in July. The context here is that over the past 3 years, in our last agreement, we fell behind inflation. And over the past 10 years, we also fell behind inflation. Government put out a claim that that's not true. That's completely false. And in fact, the inflation measure that we're using, which is the BC Consumer Price Index, all items 12-month average, and the averaging period we're using is one that was mutually agreed to in writing by ourselves and the employer and government. So we're very confident in our figures. But the stat that's not kind of being told there is that over that 10-year period, the average wage in BC, as released in an August report by StatsCan, went up by about quite a bit more over that 10-year period, about 12% higher over that. It's actually a 9-year period from actually 2015 to 2024. The average wage went up about 12% higher than our wages went up, and so what you're seeing is while we've been below inflation, we've been far below the average wage increase, and so today civil servants in BC are making 2.7% less than the average wage. So the first point I want to say around the misinformation is government is claiming that we did better than inflation. That's simply not true. That's false. But I think if you benchmark this to the average wage in the province, which I'm sure most of your listeners would agree is a much better measure, that's what measures the actual labor market, the tale is much, much worse. So the second piece that I would say is in negotiations, our offer on the table was 4% in the first year and 4.25 in the second. Government's was 1.5 and 2, or the equivalent of 2 and 2, with some other inducements. But both parties had additional money on the table for some options to provide additional redress for low wage employees, as well as additional inducements, entitlements, things like boot allowances or some specific classification adjustments, that kind of thing. What they've done is they've done two problems here. One, they've taken the entirety of those additional options, which is not the whole proposal, it's simply an option of proposals, and they've brought them together and they've conflated them with the general wage increase. So that's completely false. But the second thing they've done is they've in their costing is off by over 100 million. In what the cost of those inducements are if you put them all together. So they've really failed on two levels here. First, it's completely inappropriate to try and conflate the general wage increase with, which is a direct ask, with a series of options for targeted adjustments and allowances. But the second problem is they've miscosted it. It's over 100 million more on the costing. And so, we've gone to great lengths to ensure the accuracy of our data. We've actually reached out and asked for their data. They've declined to provide it. We've actually filed an FOI request. We filed to try and figure out the data they're using. We haven't gotten that back. So we're very confident that the information they're putting out is not correct.
So for the people to understand these, you're basically saying here's some things that we would like, and then they've just taken that whole package and costed that, and you're saying some of these things are flexible, we'd take this over that, or different things, and you're saying there's some flexibility, and they've taken the whole menu and said this is what they actually want, where you're saying there's some flexibility in some of those asks.
Yeah, and not only that, but also I would say that they've acknowledged that's the case, but also they've acknowledged this isn't that's not money for a general wage increase. Right, and so by conflating those things, I think there's a real problem here because it's not accurate.
So what have the settlements been in some of that? I know you're saying you're behind, but what have the settlements have been like in some of the other unions? Because my memory, I think that some of them are settling in the 4% range. Is that like kind of the norm for some of the other bigger unions? Are they settling to kind of make up for inflation right now in that 4% target?
Yeah, so it's important to understand. If I can zoom out a bit here, it's important to understand that this inflationary trend's been happening for a while, and so we saw, basically we saw a period right prior to COVID where inflation spiked quite a bit, and in fact, over that 3-year period prior to COVID, our wages were 7% below the increase in the average wage in BC, right? And so by the time we got into that COVID inflation boom, what you saw, we were already underwater. Consistently, what we've seen at different levels of government, whether it's federal or municipal or the ones that you kind of compare to, those wages have gone up substantively more. If you look at municipal workers across the province, if you look at municipal firefighters, if you look at municipal civic workers, if you look at federal workers, by all those comparators, our members in the similar or identical occupations, or it's hard to say identical, but similar occupations which have similar requirements, et cetera, they're well behind there, both in terms of the total wage that they make and in terms of the yearly annual increases. And so we think our asks are reasonable. And look, that's why we think the polling that's been released shows that the majority of British Columbians also think our asks are reasonable.
The NDP, I mean, when my dad was a big staunch believer in the NDP, and that was kind of like the representative of the unions and the people. And that, do you think David Evy's government has gone away from that? When you look at the BC Ferries deal and stuff like that, do you still see the NDP as a friend or more of a foe now for unions in general?
I think that's not the way that I've ever seen government as a friend or foe. That's really a different paradigm for me. For me, the way I approach government is, in our case, they're an employer, and so there's two sides to this here, right? So one is they're our employer, and there's an inherently adversarial system here, and we have to do our best, in terms of that system, to fairly represent the interests of our members. But more than that, they're a special employer, in that they're also the democratically elected government. And and I think the issue that I think a lot of people are having is, and I think this is the fundamental one, is what is the plan, right? Where are we going as a province? And I think for us, what we want to see is that there needs to be a recognition that working people are falling so far behind because of the affordability crisis, because of the cost of living, that there's simply a point where people say, look, I'm at a subsistence level of living. I'm essentially making money to pay my rent and pay my grocery bills, and then I'm falling behind when an unexpected expense comes up. And that's not how it used to be. That's not acceptable. We're one of the wealthiest places in the world here. That's totally unacceptable to be happening here. So, I think I would say that there's continuity between this government and the prior government and the government before that. And so we're not trying to single out this particular government as being friend or foe. That so much. And, I would say that we're in an adversarial relationship with every government on those issues. What we want to see from our government on a democratic level, we want to see government start to have broader planning. First of all, hold its own internal bureaucracy accountable. This massive explosion in the number of excluded managers across, not just in the civil service, but across the health sector, across all these sectors, it's totally unacceptable. And I think taxpayers should think it's unacceptable. It makes no sense.
What do you see these these strikes, like the Air Canada strike, for instance, and it seemed like that one was pretty much a no-brainer. They're not getting paid for doing, like work while they're at work, and then, and then the government recommended they take the deal, and it sounded like the union recommended they take the deal, and then resoundingly the flight attendants said they're not interested in that deal. Do you think the public perception of unions is good or bad in this environment?
Well, I think the public look. I think this is less about unions. I do think there's a positive public perception for unions for the most part, but I think I'll just say unions we're our own worst critics. But the public perception right now is in favor of working people. People know it's hard to get by. There's an undeniable reality. You have to be really detached from a shared reality to claim that people are not struggling in BC to get by with the cost of everything going up. It's just it's manifest and it's obvious. And so we saw that in the flight attendant situation, and I'm not going to comment on the unions negotiations or positions. I'm not familiar with what their internal position is. I did attend and show up at their picket lines to support them, as did a number of other BCGEU members. But I'll say that what we saw there, and I think what you rightly pointed to, is that there's a massive upsurge in public support for people standing up and saying, "Hey, I shouldn't do unpaid work. I should get a decent wage. This makes sense." And look, I think you wouldn't be seeing this if people were asking for ridiculous things, and I think the public knows we're not.
Yeah, I mean, we do lots of stories, and I've done one recently where a lot of British Columbians and Canadians, for that matter, are about $200 away from being solvent for the month, for covering their monthly obligations. And I know that it's tough out there. Very, very tough, and we're seeing that with employers as well, like small employers, small businesses, where they're 1 in 5 say they're going to close up. I mean, it's a tough environment, and the revenue side of it as well plays a big role in the BC government and in like the small businesses and that. And I guess, has the government done enough to boost their revenues as opposed to always looking at cutting costs? Do you see that? Are they balancing that equation very well?
Well, it's, sometimes it's both, but the question is, where do you cut? And like I said, if you're hiring excluded managers at almost double the rate of frontline workers, at some point you've got to say, well, what's the limitation? And we asked government that across the table. We said, what's the ratio that's acceptable to you in terms of the management that you need to run the civil service in the broader public sector? What's the rate? And they said, there is no ratio. We just do whatever we want. Mm-hmm. Like, this is a failure to govern properly. And so, but when it comes to the province, when it comes to revenues, look, instead of giving a tax break to a resource development project, what they should do is have that subsidiary company that the government gets shares in as deferred taxation, as share value, and say, look, we're not going to give you a tax break, but we can defer those taxes into share value so that we will jointly prosper from the success of this venture. And that's a much better control when it comes to regulatory aspects, et cetera, is if you have board seats on that subsidiary company, that's a much better form of control. There's a lot of Nordic nations that have done that. There's a lot of Arctic nations like Canada that have done that model, and it works really well. So, there's a way to do this, but even when it comes to things like procurement, for massive infrastructure projects, great that they're doing all this infrastructure procurement. But if you don't do the procurement properly, you end up overpaying for that, right? There's only so many resources and labor available and bidders to do that work. And if you don't have a broad enough pool of resources and labor and companies that can bid on that work, you're just going to end up overpaying because you haven't laddered the procurement appropriately. And I think that's what we're seeing here.
We do thank you for coming on here. I do notice that you've been doing a lot of the media shows and stuff like that to get your message out. Is there something I didn't touch on that you would like to share with viewers in British Columbia as to what your members want and what a fair deal looks like?
Absolutely. I want to emphasize this point. Last week we had the entire bargaining committee. I brought my entire bargaining committee to Victoria. We waited to see if the employer would come and table a revised wage offer over what our members rejected by 93%. They declined to do that. So we're ready to bargain. Government's refusing to negotiate. We're going to continue escalating as we need to. So far, that escalation, we've taken great care to minimize the impact to the public. At a certain point, that will be unavoidable, and you're going to start seeing that impact, and it'll be felt quite a bit. Our ask is for people to pressure government get back to the table, get a fair deal, and let's settle this.
Well, I do thank you for your time today, Paul, and we'll check in with you as this thing progresses. Hopefully it comes to a good result very soon so that both the workers and the people that they serve can enjoy continuity of service.
Right on. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you for watching Now Media.
We don't just report the news. We live here too. We're your neighbors, bringing you stories that matter to all of us. No government